The wind moves through empty streets where voices once argued, traded, and hoped. Wooden walls still stand, but no one remembers the hands that built them. The desert keeps its silence, even as it slowly erases what humans believed would last. There are no graves marked clearly. No final letters. No official end. Only a town that vanished without leaving a reason behind. During the 19th century, Nevada became a place defined by movement, uncertainty, and expectation. The discovery of mineral deposits across the region drew thousands westward, transforming empty stretches of desert into temporary centers of activity. Trails became routes of hope, and rumors of opportunity were often enough to justify extreme risk. In this environment, small settlements appeared quickly, driven less by planning and more by necessity. The town at the center of this story emerged during this period of rapid expansion. It was not founded by government order or long-term vision, but by individuals responding to circumstance. Prospectors, laborers, merchants, and their families arrived gradually, building what they needed to survive rather than what they intended to preserve. At first, the settlement consisted of tents and makeshift shelters, which were later replaced by wooden structures as confidence grew. A general store was established to serve both residents and passing travelers. A saloon followed soon after, becoming a place of rest and routine. A boarding house provided temporary shelter for newcomers, while storage sheds and small workshops filled the remaining space. The town developed without formal boundaries, shaped instead by the limits of the land and the availability of resources. Water defined every decision. A shallow well and a nearby seasonal spring made settlement possible, though never secure. As long as water could be drawn, the town justified its existence. Residents accepted scarcity as part of life in the desert, believing that endurance was temporary and that improvement would follow. Daily life settled into predictable patterns. Mining claims were worked inconsistently. Wagons arrived with supplies when weather and distance allowed. Children learned basic lessons in shared spaces, and evenings were marked by lamplight and quiet conversation. The town was not prosperous, but it functioned. The environment remained harsh but stable enough to allow routine. Heat dominated the days, while nights brought cold and silence. Sand was constant, carried by wind into homes and streets, but it was treated as an inconvenience rather than a warning. Few questioned whether the land itself might eventually refuse them. At this stage, the town appeared sustainable. Maps briefly acknowledged its presence, and regional records mentioned it in passing. For those living there, it was not temporary. It was home. As the years passed, the settlement began to change in ways that were subtle at first and difficult to measure. The population stopped growing, and new arrivals became rare. Those who remained noticed that daily routines required more effort than before, even though nothing dramatic had occurred. The town still existed, but its momentum had slowed. Mining activity became inconsistent. Some claims produced less material than expected, while others were quietly abandoned. Without steady output, trade declined. Supply wagons arrived less frequently, delayed by distance, weather, or lack of profit. Essential goods became harder to replace, and prices increased without explanation. Water became the central concern. The seasonal spring no longer flowed as reliably as it once had, and the well required deeper digging to maintain even minimal access. Each bucket was used carefully, and waste was avoided whenever possible. Conversations increasingly returned to the same topic, though no one spoke openly about leaving. The landscape itself began to shift. Sand accumulated closer to buildings, forming low dunes along walls and doorways. Roads that once connected the town to surrounding trails became less distinct, often erased after windstorms. Markers and posts disappeared, forcing travelers to rely on memory rather than signs. Maintenance replaced expansion. Instead of constructing new structures, residents spent their time reinforcing existing ones. Windows were boarded to block wind-driven sand. Roofs were secured against constant pressure. Streets were cleared repeatedly, only to fill again within days. Some families chose to leave without ceremony. They packed their belongings quietly and departed before conditions worsened further. Their homes were left intact, as though abandonment were temporary. Others remained, believing that endurance was preferable to retreat and that conditions would stabilize with time. The desert did not change suddenly, but it did not reverse its course either. Windstorms became more frequent, carrying fine sand that entered every space, regardless of effort. Livestock suffered from limited water and poor grazing. Illness increased, aggravated by dust and isolation. Communication with the outside world weakened. Mail arrived irregularly, and news from other settlements became outdated by the time it was received. The town became increasingly inward, dependent only on itself and the decisions of those who remained. By the end of this period, the settlement was no longer growing or adapting. It was resisting. Every choice was made to delay loss rather than secure a future. The desert continued its advance, indifferent to intention, effort, or belief. The final phase of the town's existence did not begin with a single event, but with the gradual collapse of certainty. By this point, most residents understood that conditions were no longer temporary. Water access had become unreliable despite repeated attempts to deepen the well, and the seasonal spring failed entirely. Without water, every other concern became secondary. Meetings were held in remaining public spaces, often inside buildings already half filled with sand. Discussions focused on survival rather than growth. Relocation was considered, but the distance to the nearest settlement was greater than many could safely manage with limited supplies. Staying carried its own risks, yet leaving offered no guarantee. Windstorms intensified in frequency and duration. Sand no longer drifted slowly but moved in constant waves, pressing against walls and entering through reinforced doors and boarded windows. Interiors became difficult to maintain. Furniture was raised off floors. Belongings were packed repeatedly, then unpacked, as decisions were delayed. Several structures began to fail under accumulated weight. Roof beams cracked. Walls leaned inward. The saloon, once the center of communal life, collapsed after a prolonged storm, its roof caving under sand pressure rather than age. The loss was symbolic as much as practical, marking the end of shared space. Livestock losses increased. Without reliable water, animals weakened and were either slaughtered early or abandoned. Food stores diminished rapidly. Illness spread more easily in confined, dust-filled environments, and medical supplies were limited or non-existent. Departures resumed, this time without hesitation. Small groups left at dawn or late evening, hoping to avoid heat and conserve strength. Wagons moved slowly, heavily loaded with essentials. Tracks disappeared quickly behind them, erased by wind before they could serve as guidance for others. Some residents remained despite the odds. Age, injury, or lack of resources made departure impossible. Their presence is documented only indirectly, through abandoned belongings and unfinished preparations. There are no records of their final days. Eventually, the town ceased functioning as a settlement. No services remained. No coordination existed. Each structure stood alone, exposed to the environment without maintenance or protection. The general store closed last, its supplies exhausted and its purpose lost. By the end, the town did not experience destruction in the conventional sense. There was no fire or flood to mark its end. Instead, it reached a point where human presence could no longer be sustained. The desert assumed control, quietly and completely. After the last departure, the town no longer functioned as a place of human life. What remained stood without purpose or protection. Buildings were left unlocked. Tools lay where they had last been used. Personal items remained inside rooms that would never be entered again. The desert did not rush. It advanced steadily, shaped by wind and time rather than force. Sand accumulated along walls and inside doorways. Roofs weakened under constant pressure. Wooden frames dried, cracked, and eventually failed. One structure collapsed, then another, until no clear outline of the town remained. There was no official record of abandonment. No document marked the final day. The settlement simply stopped appearing in correspondence, reports, and maps. Routes shifted. Trails bypassed the area. The name fell out of use. Travelers who passed nearby in later years saw only dunes and open land. Any remaining signs were indistinct and easily mistaken for natural formations. Without markers or memory, the location lost its meaning. It became anonymous terrain. The people who lived there were not commemorated. Their decisions, struggles, and losses were absorbed into the wider movement of westward expansion, where countless similar stories blended together. Without surviving witnesses, details faded quickly. What could not be recorded was forgotten. Over time, even the idea of a town disappeared. The desert smoothed its surface. Wind erased sharp edges. The ground settled into uniform silence. What had once been streets, rooms, and gathering places became indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. No moral lesson emerged from its disappearance. There was no final warning. The town did not fail because of a single mistake or moment. It ended because conditions made continued presence impossible. Today, nothing rises above the sand to suggest that people once believed this place could last. There are no signs to read. No ruins to interpret. Only open desert remains. History moved on. Memory did not follow. The town became absent. If this story mattered to you, consider subscribing. More forgotten history is coming.